Here we go. I want to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Cuddler properly. I've always talked about what an awesome human being he is and how proud I am to have him as a friend. I just wanted to give a little bit of his background. Dr. Cuddler received his MD from Downstate Medical Center, trained in psychiatry at Yale, and is associate consulting professor at Duke. From 2000 to 2005, he co-chaired VA Special Committee on PTSD, which reported to Congress. He served on the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Board of Directors, co-led development of joint VA Department of Defense guidelines for the management of post-traumatic stress, and advised Sesame Street's Talk, Listen, Connect series for military families. From 2006 to 2014, he co-led the North Carolina Governor's focus on returning military members and their families, and in 2012 was appointed to the North Carolina Institute of Medicine. From 2004 to 2014, Dr. Cuddler was Associate Director of the VA's Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center, also known as MIRIC, on deployment mental health. In July 2014, he joined VA Central Office in Washington, D.C. as Chief Consultant for Mental Health Services. Starting in May 2017, he served as Acting Assistant Deputy Under Secretary for Patient Care Services until his retirement from the VA in June 2018. Dr. Cuddler remains on the Duke faculty and plays an active leadership role in a number of professional organizations and as a without compensation employee in the VA Physician Ambassador Champion Program. He also provides consultation in clinical and administrative settings and is developing an integrated set of writing projects designed to advance the mental health and wellness of service members, veterans, their families, and communities. So how lucky is North Carolina that we got Dr. Cuddler back here? He's helped us with the Governor's Challenge. He's helped us to get over obstacles that we thought were obstacles that he completely understood. He lays a wonderful path for us. Welcome, Dr. Cuddler. It's so good to see you again.
Well, thank you, Crystal. And, really, as I listen to you read that overly long introduction, which I should never have sent you that long introduction. The fact is that I don't think I would have known where to work on a career if it hadn't been for this group of people that living the life in North Carolina, meeting so many of you helped me figure out what was important. And I'm really, really thankful to this group for that. So let's go ahead. I think, should I be sharing my screen at this point?
Nope, it should be coming up for you.
Well, there it is. And I'll just tell you to advance the slides. So,
yes, sir.
So it's really a pleasure to welcome today's panel on the social determinants of suicide. And this is our 5th session, right, on this issue and the concluding one. And it's been a very valuable conversation. So let's get right into it. I get to have an opening presentation, a case in point, I've called it. And this is partly a personal story, which Jeff encouraged me to tell, partly because I think it's a Marine story, but I think it kind of goes to the insights we're sharing today. I think the entire panel didn't fall from the sky. They didn't develop in a test tube. They're very human stories. And it's by sharing human stories that we get there. And here's a human story of my own. Shortly after his confirmation as VA Undersecretary for Health, Dr. David Shulkin read a newspaper article in the Times. So this is a quote from his book, which is entitled, "It Shouldn't Be So Hard to Serve Your Country." This is at the very beginning of his tenure in VA. And he says, on December 29th, 2015, I picked up the New York Times and found a front page story about a cluster of suicides. So much for my peaceful lunch. I felt sick to my stomach and my mind began to race. I called my suicide prevention team together and asked for ideas. I asked them to organize a suicide summit with the best minds in medicine. I also said I wanted it within 30 days. The team left my office red-faced, but they agreed to my deadline. I was one of the people he called in. I was a senior officer on the suicide prevention team, not because I was a great expert, but because it was a part of my mental health office. And because it was the holidays, there were only a few of us around at the table. And I remember the scene very well. Dr. Shulkin held up the newspaper article, and then he threw the New York Times so hard down on his board table that it slid the entire length of the table. And he said, what this article really says is that veterans are dying by suicide and the VA isn't doing anything. The VA doesn't care. And he wasn't going to have that. And of course, none of us wanted it. And put that way, what were we going to do about this? I want to point out that that was the third in a series of articles in the New York Times by Dave Phillips, who had embedded himself in Afghanistan with the Marine 2nd Battalion, 7th Regiment, and now was following that unit since their return home. In the series, here's the very first in that series, headline, Suicide Claims 14th Marine from a Unit Battered by Loss. And in that article was this picture of Noel Guerrero. And the caption said, and it's kind of hard to see, I know, he's in the dark attic, or rather his garage. It says he keeps his dress uniform with his Purple Heart in his garage. Mr. Guerrero, 28 years old, said the war had left him with a dark shadow you can never take away. I will say that the real problem, the reason we seem to be so obstructionistic wasn't that we were against having a summit on suicide prevention. It was because Dr. Shulkin, being new in government, didn't understand how long it would take federal contractors to get us a hotel banquet room big enough to have a meeting with the 200 people we ended up inviting. As a matter of fact, we only finally got the contract signed 2 days before the meeting began. We had senior members of Congress, experts from all over the country flying into Washington, and we weren't able to tell them where the meeting was until 2 days before it started. But he apologized to the meeting for having done that to us, and it was a terrific meeting. So let's talk about it a bit. There was, in addition to the summit, which included the heads of the House and Senate Committees on Veterans Affairs, a taped message from President Obama, Martin Luther King III speaking. A number of real goods were suggested as recommendations out of that meeting. They included the elevation of the VA Office of Suicide Prevention, which was, just, as I say, a component of the Mental Health Office, to answer directly to the Secretary. Additional suicide prevention coordinators were hired across the country. We expanded from 1 telemental health hub to 3 telemental health hubs. And we didn't know it then, but this was tremendously important in getting ready for COVID. And it's one reason VA was able to transition to COVID virtual mental health care so easily, as well as enhancements to the Veterans Crisis Line and new research programs, one of which led to the development of VA's predictive suicide analytic system, ReachFed. But that wasn't really all that needed to be done. And another thing that kind of got started with this meeting, and actually with that very first New York Times phone call, was an interagency action. And this was something unprecedented in suicide prevention in the US government. In the end, 78 staff from 19 federal and state agencies, including VA, Navy Medicine, the Defense Suicide Prevention Office, the CDC, SAMHSA, the US Marine Corps, the US Public Health Service, and state law enforcement agents and coroners from across the entire nation came together to understand what was going on with the Marine 27. Was there a suicide cluster? If so, how could we understand it? And how could we take what we would learn from this massive study, which took almost 2 years to complete, that would help us prevent suicide? Well, at the end of about 1.5 years of research, we were surprised to find out that, well, the CDC, first of all, determined statistically that there wasn't a suicide cluster, even though the rate of suicide in this unit was 4 times what was expected for most Marine units. It didn't meet the statistical definition for a cluster, so the CDC declined being further involved in any survey of the living Marines in the 27 to identify any needs and modifiable risk factors. We did identify missed opportunities, however, including a reluctance among the Marines to report mental health or traumatic brain injury problems while still on active duty. It would have potentially got them taken off the line, in which case their buddies would have been vulnerable and they weren't going to allow that to happen. It also could have affected their security clearance and their deployability in the future. We noted a lack of a warm handoff between DOD and VA, so that if one of these 2-7 members had a mental health appointment of any kind while they were still in the military, on the average, it took 1.5 years for them to get their first appointment with the VA. And that was way too long. We had to figure out how to bridge that gap. And then the other major finding was that family members and significant others mostly were unaware of the warning signs of suicide. They weren't even aware that their loved one was at risk for suicide and where to seek assistance if they did detect the problem. Let's go to the next slide. But if you drill down even further, particularly to the coroner's reports and the police reports, because we got detailed information on everyone who died by suicide in that in the Marine 2-7, and we read all their reports. And what it boiled down to the same scenario over and over, not every case, but most cases. A pattern of unstable relationships that had even been very strong before they went to war, that had become unstable, especially with partners, spouses, children, intoxication, alcohol, especially in the middle of the night, an argument in the middle of the night with a loved one, followed by a slammed front door, as somebody stormed out of the house in a huff, and a loaded weapon within easy reach. These were common factors in the suicides in the 2-7. And, you know, for people who were statisticians or psychiatrists, the question of, well, what are we supposed to do about that? I mean, are we supposed to be there in the middle of the night? What can we do? How do we take the alcohol out of their hands? How do we get the weapon locked and unloaded? Well, you know, we didn't have the answers to that. Let's go to the next slide. But what we realized was there was a need to complement the kind of institutional suicide prevention approaches which big organizations like the CDC, SAMHSA, the VA, the Defense Suicide Prevention Office were working with at that point. What do we do as a healthcare system, for example, and begin to think at a much more personal and intimate level. I want to come back to Noel Guerrero here because he's quoted in that New York Times article saying the following. Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually an excerpt from the VA's Make the Connection website. But Noel, who gets around a lot, and I got to know a little bit, Noel said this on the VA website, written for other veterans. My name is Noel, and I served with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in Afghanistan in 2008. For myself, it didn't really get hard until I transitioned out. I realized that everybody's just scattered. And now I'm kind of doing it on my own. Some of the symptoms that I noticed immediately for me were the restlessness, not being able to sleep at night. I started realizing I wasn't trusting anybody. I was isolating myself from anything that could be associated with good. I had a hard time trusting people. I think this is a story all of us recognize. Frankly, this is a story that my World War II veterans, when I worked with them in the VA in the 1980s, told me the exact same story. There was a certain time where I didn't want to live anymore. I just wanted to die. It was the weirdest thing. I was sitting on my couch one day and I just started crying. I just kind of balled up into a corner. All of a sudden, it was just like a little kid, you know? I just couldn't stop crying, and I just hated myself so much at that very, very moment, and I just didn't want to be here anymore. Next slide, please. So we follow the story in Dave Phillips' first New York Times article in September 2015. Dave Phillips was interviewing another member of the 2-7, now citizen, Mr. Mr. Bojores. I had that down so well before I started speaking. He got a text from Mr. Guerrero in the middle of the night. I don't think I can do this life anymore, it said. And that night, Mr. Guerrero had been watching television with his wife after church when something snapped. He crumbled to the floor and backed into a corner crying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The panic and guilt were so excruciating that he decided the only relief was to kill himself. He went to his porch with shaking hands to text Mr. Bajorges to say goodbye. Mr. Bajorges called immediately. Mr. Guerrero picked up sobbing, but after a few words hung up. He, Mr. Bajorges, knew he had to call 911, but he hesitated. The call might land Mr. Guerrero in a psychiatric ward or ruin his marriage, already strained. Worse, if the police barged in, his friend might go berserk, and we all know stories where that really happens. Someone could get hurt, but what choice was there? The police pounded on the door just as Mr. Guerrero put a handful of pills in his mouth. Let's keep going. Some months later, Mr. Guerrero took Mr. Bajorges on his favorite run to the top of a mountain behind his house. He had placed an old metal ammunition box at the top where Marines could leave letters and sign their name. He would send out a challenge to the Marines to climb this mountain, find the box, and put in some testimony or read the testimonies that were in there. He dedicated that box to the men of the Forgotten Battalion, a name he gave to the 2-7. It was 5 winding miles to the summit. When they reached it, the two stood side by side, catching their breath and looking out at the dawn spreading over the ocean. Mr. Bajorges hung his arm over his friend's shoulder. Mr. Guerrero broke the silence. "I'm glad I got to share this with you," he told his friend. "I wish I could bring the whole battalion up here." And I want to emphasize that line because it was months after this was published and after our interagency team got to work and looked at all our stuff that we came to that same conclusion. And here's a picture on October 6th of 2017, where we succeeded in bringing a representative sample of the 2-7 together from as far away as Guam to Stafford, Virginia, just the next exit down from Quantico. These are Marines, all members of the 2-7 who had deployed in the during the deployments that were associated with the increased risk of suicide. This was we took this group picture during a kind of a getting to know one another exercise. Some of the people in it, including to the 2-7 Marines, here's Navy Captain. You can't see my slide. You can't see my cursor, but we have Navy Captain Bob Kaufman, who was the first Chief Medical Officer of the Intrepid Center of Excellence in Bethesda. We have Karen Gunter, who is one of the founders of Semper Fi, a support organization for Marines. We have me with a rather pathetic picture, and we have a group of 2-7 Marines. Let's go to the next slide. So we met at a hotel. It was much easier for Semper Fi to come up with the contract to get a hotel. And we put these guys up for a long weekend, and I drove in and out from Washington down to Stafford for these meetings. And it was sponsored by the Semper Fi Fund rather than DOD or VA because we wanted it to be a grassroots thing, a Marine branded exercise, not a VA or DOD medical exercise. As we framed it, it was a reunion rather than any kind of form of clinical assessment or treatment. And it was an informational session in which we shared findings from nearly 2 years of interagency study and then invited this Marine group to constitute a peer-led focus group on behalf of their fellow members. And once we finally realized that having them fill out diagnostic questionnaires, which was one of the initial suggestions for this meeting, would only make them feel like lab rats, that's the term that one of the Marines used, we agreed that the purpose of this meeting ought to be for us to learn from them, the members of the 2-7, and engage them as full partners going forwards. And as kind of going back to my remarks about Jeff, that's very much the spirit of Governor's Work Group. And I think my experience in Governor's Work Group helped me see this a little faster than I might otherwise have seen. And came up with a plan based on hours of telling them what we had seen and going over our slides and their findings and then talking among the group. all of them knew friends who had died by suicide from the unit. Many of them had attempted suicide. Noel Guerrero is one of them there speaking to this. We decided this is going to be the plan. Really, they decided. Let's do an outreach and touch all of the 1,280 2-7 members who had served in these deployments associated with higher rates of suicide. But rather than have famous people do it, commanding officers do it, sergeant majors do it, celebrities who were in the 2-7. The 2-7 seem to have more than a share of celebrity people. I won't name names right now, but we thought about asking those famous people to do it. These guys said, no, we want the grunts to do it. We want to do the outreach ourselves. We don't want professionals or officers or celebrities. We'll do it. They asked us, could you train every unit member to know the signs of suicide risk? And I would translate that into terms of like mental health literacy, the VA SAVE training. Could we share that with all their members and their families? And as well as train them about the resources to reach out to. And of course we could. And could we train some of the 2-7 members as certified veteran peer support specialists? By this time, the VA had almost 1,500 certified peer support specialists. The governor's work group helped develop and promote those training programs here in North Carolina, mostly through our community college system years ago. And yes, we said we could do that. Could we upgrade the 2-7? They had a social media platform that was basically a Facebook page with a Google spreadsheet that had everybody's names and contact information. They asked us, could we upgrade that social media platform with artificial intelligence capable of tracking abrupt changes? Was someone talking all the time? Did someone who was talking stop talking? Were people only talking in the middle of the night? And the AI, the artificial intelligence, would alert friends, family members, and the peer support specialists if there was an abrupt change, or if keywords connected to suicide maybe came up, or ending one's life. Peer support was, in fact, the dominant theme identified by the 2-7's members as what they want. That's the strategy they wanted to follow. Could we help them support each other? And they'd be glad for professional help when it was needed, but they wanted to do this for each other. Let's keep going. So what are the outcomes of all this? Not as beautifully measured as some CDC studies might show, but important. Semper Fi Fund stepped up and sponsored the training of 40 Marines, including a number of 2-7 members, to be certified veteran peer support specialists. And that was accomplished by the next June, by June 2018. Noel Guerrero is one of those peer support specialists. VA's Office of General Counsel provided clearance for VA. I had the full names of the 1,280 2-7 members, but I couldn't share them without clearance from our legal department. I'd gotten from the Department of Defense. And with a little bit of persuasion and begging, the Office of General Counsel said, yes, you can share this in order to help these people with those peer support specialists. So now they had a targeted group, and with 40 peer support specialists and 1,280 members, they were able to do outreach to the entire group and to individual members, and then continue to form relationships with those people. A battalion retreat was planned through Semper Fi. There was planned fielding of the new social media network, although I have to tell you, I don't think that ever got up and running. I worked even after I left VA Central Office on a project to do that, but nobody could agree on what that would be. And I don't think the social media system was good enough to do what we wanted to do then. And I'm still going to double check on where that is now. The idea was, though, that as we build the system and use it and get feedback from the unit, we could replicate this approach with other military units. Why wouldn't every military unit have that opportunity to support one another, to build their mental health literacy, to build pathways back for the right help when they needed it? And I'm just, the next slide is simply to say questions, but I'll sum up by saying that I honestly believe that for all the good things that the VA and the Department of Defense and the many groups who are our partners in the governor's work group are doing, if we're not partners, full partners with the end users, the people the system was designed for, if they're not designing it with us and implementing it with us, I don't think it's going to work as well. And I'm glad to say that I think in North Carolina, we've made real inroads. And let me stop on that point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cuddler. It makes all too much sense, doesn't it? Next up, we have Tommy Ryman. I hope I said that right. Tommy served 15 years in the U.S. Army as an infantryman and was deployed 3 times. His favorite job in the Army was his time on a long-range surveillance, or LRS, team. Tommy is a Silver Star and Purple Heart recipient. He was featured as a guest in President George Bush's 2007 State of the Union address. He is a video game character, action figure, and the key cast member in Halfway Home, a documentary about the struggles of reintegrating life after conflict. Tommy has led several veteran organizations and is now in operations at Northwood Ravin, a luxury apartment developer, construction, and property management company based out of Charlotte. Tommy and his wife Justine are proud parents of 4, Landon, Ellie, Noah, and Ben. He is a diehard Carolina Panthers and a NASCAR fan. Welcome, Tommy.
Thanks, Crystal. It's Tommy Rieman.
Rieman.
No
Yes,
worries.
sir.
Everybody messes it up. Thank you all that have talked earlier today. Jeff Smith, special shout out. General Gaskin, you're doing a great job, especially as a Marine. Keep it up. Paul Cruz, if you're on, I love you. You're doing an awesome job as well. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a big shout out to my former family over at Veterans Bridge Home. So hi, Blake and team. Keep up the incredible work. I'm here to really today to talk about some of my personal experience and then my perspective where we're at today. You know, in this space, especially as an infantryman, an enlisted guy, complaining about problems is like the MO of the soldier or the young Marine. He can tell you everything wrong with it, but can't tell you how to fix it. And through the years, I've had to learn how to be patient, especially at a problem this large. I came into this out of Independence, Kentucky, a family of 4, my mom and dad and my sister. And I always knew I wanted to join the Army, but I came up with childhood trauma, things I didn't understand. I had 0 emotional intelligence. I typically ran away from problems. I had a suicide attempt at a young age, and the military was like the best thing for me and my options at the time. So I joined in 1999, and it was the best thing I could do for myself at the time. It taught me, you know, values and all these other great things that I've developed throughout the years. Leading up to that, I got to be in a LURS team, which is like a special operations team. It's a 6-man team that goes deep behind enemy lines and identifies targets to technically call in airstrikes. But more than anything, you're just providing information so the command staff can make better decisions on the battlefield, real-time decisions. I deployed in Iraq in 2003, and there I got lit up pretty badly. I was shot in the arm, the chest, and took 11 pieces of shrapnel. We were ambushed by a large enemy force. I protected some of my guys and was wounded and medevaced away from that. That day had changed my life forever. I mean, I experienced combat for almost 18 months, but that day specifically, because I was in Baghdad one day and then the next day I wasn't. And quickly life changed and altered, as it does every day, but it's expedited, especially around combat. So from 2003 till 2007, 8, 9, I was dealing with things I could never understand or couldn't understand at the time. Things of, you know, alcoholism and communications and lack of emotional intelligence and marriage and children and trying to be an adult and life after combat, life outside of the military. I left active duty in 2007 and then joined the National Guard in late 2007, early 2008. I really struggled through those times, and it was some of the darker times in my life. I didn't recognize who I was, who I'd become. I started to make decisions that were not in the best interest of myself or my family, and it led to pretty severe circumstances. I redeployed in 2010, trying to escape my life here in the States. I, went through a marriage and plenty of relationships that ruined. I felt like I was a failure as a father. And my way of getting away from that was going back to combat. And then this crazy thought that combat, going back to Iraq was the one where I would find myself. I lost myself there in 2003, and I thought I could find myself again in 2010. And I was sadly mistaken. It was a completely different conflict. In 2010, the rules of engagement had changed. I was there with the National Guard. We were deploying convoy security to sustain operations. It was just, it was kind of a nightmare for myself. I didn't understand why we were there, and it was a complete cultural change and shift. After I came back, I, was still in the Guard, but you reintegrate as a civilian, and that transition process, there really isn't much to it. And you don't necessarily take the time to process everything that goes on, and that reintegration can be really tough. So I tried to get back on my feet and live life, and I did a pretty good job, but I was still hurting internally. And so there were multiple times where I just kept hitting my rock bottom, and, due to alcoholism and several suicide attempts, I was just kind of going nowhere. And the one thing that I learned through a lot of these things was a good portion of the problems wasn't necessarily combat. It was relationship problems. And, that emotional intelligence I lacked. I know you guys will hear Dr. French talk about name it to tame it. That's a big thing for me, understanding what's going on to be able to address it. It sounds so easy now, but it was such a difficult task at the time. So in 2013, I had enough. I'd hit rock bottom. My relationship ended. I didn't know how to communicate with her, lost that relationship. And at this point, I felt like the ultimate failure. So I wrote a goodbye letter to my kids, and I got in a vehicle, intoxicated on purpose with a plan, and attempted to kill myself. When I opened my eyes from this accident, I was pretty disappointed in myself. I didn't have a scratch on me. I wasn't able to go through with it. And at that point, I knew I needed some real assistance. So I went to the VA, and it didn't get all the help that I needed there. And it was through another friend that reached out. And because of that network that I had built up through the years, I had people reaching out saying, let me help you. So I did. I had this gentleman, West Huddleston, who was an angel who, out of the ordinary said, let me come to you. We'll take you out to rehab and pay for your rehab and get you clean and sober. And that was the greatest decision that I ever made, was accepting the assistance and saying that it was the time. So I spent 47 days in rehab, and then slowly but surely started to work my way every day with intentional work to remain clean and sober, so to give myself a chance at life, to be a father, to have relationships, to live. But it had to start, with a clear mind. I couldn't address, and I had tried multiple times to address all the internal conflict that I had had with my previous trauma, but was never able to do it intoxicated on anything. So to me, that was a real big stepping point. The other was reintegration into a community. Charlotte, I'd lived in Charlotte since 2010. And at first I was never really connected to the community. And there I was just kind of flailing. I was out there, didn't connect to community resources, didn't have people around me, didn't really build a tribe. I was just kind of used to, I can do this on my own, or, I always had the Army there for me. And I didn't understand the importance of what I had. And, I think a lot of times that's why we look back and say, man, I really wish I was still in, or I missed that piece of it. So being back in Charlotte, I didn't have that connection until, I started to get clean and sober and understand the importance of being connection to that community. And that's where Veterans Bridge Home came in. This community has done so much for me, working through some of my personal issues and my personal growth as well as my professional growth. And, I talk about us complaining as an enlisted guy early on, through the years, I've complained, man, it doesn't seem like we're getting anywhere. It doesn't seem like we're addressing some of these issues, a lot of the same thing. The reality is we are. It seems to be North Carolina especially is really doing something special here. And I think part of that's got to do with the right people in place. It seems every couple of years we'll get a new secretary, we'll get a new vision, a change in a community executive director. But it seems right now we've got the right people in place. Dr. Feng with her dedicated work, Director Cruz, General Gaskin, Veterans Bridge Home. These organizations like this, to me, are what make it a difference. To me, it starts at that community. Also, we're trying new things. I think that new perspective, or trying to change our focus and look at this from every angle possible, has only helped the situation, as well as, a lot of times veterans just want to, it seems, in my opinion, isolate or be on their own, or, hey, do you have something special for veterans? That's great sometimes, but I think our focus needs to be on inclusion and focus on things that integrate and not necessarily segregate. I think internally, I've left the veterans space, and honestly, it's one of the best things that I've done for myself personally, because I feel like now I come from this at a different lens. I was in the veterans space for quite some time, the latest time at Veterans Bridge Home, and that was the most rewarding time working at the community. But now I get a different perspective. I'm seeing these different companies in the communities and just the lack of leadership that exists. We have this amazing population with these amazing leaders that are just dying for employment, dying to get into a community, to be accepted. So it really excites me to have this new perspective, new understanding that, if we can really focus on the community level and including everybody and getting a lot of these employers in the right place to be a part of the solution. I spend most of my time every day. Most of you spend most of your time every day at work. So at the community level, getting the integration and buy-in from these businesses. And then really focusing on that sustainment within the community. Later on, you're going to hear from, Lieutenant Colonel Walliser. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear Lieutenant Colonel Walliser. This guy's a lieutenant colonel in the G1 of the National Guard, and the things and topics he's going to talk about, this will show you how far we're trending, and that the things that we are doing are working. Sometimes not fast enough, of course, but just know that I really think North Carolina's got something special going on, and we really need to stay the course. So with that, Dr. Cuddler, you can go to the next speaker, I guess.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. We really appreciate you being with here and sharing so honestly with everyone, because it's important that we hear these stories. Thank you. Next up, we have Lieutenant Colonel David Walliser. I hope I got that correct. Lieutenant Colonel Walliser has over 25 years of experience as an enlisted soldier and officer. And I'll just stop there and say that my very favorite officers were previously enlisted. No offense to any of those of you who were not enlisted first. He has had overseas deployments with Operation Desert Thunder 2, Desert Fox, and Operation Enduring Freedom. He is an experienced officer with tenures in operations and personnel management. We're so glad to have you with us today. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel Walliser.
Well, Crystal, thank you so much. And I'm going to apologize up front. The Army has decided to block video to Zoom right now. So you'll have to deal with my voice and the slides that I have in front of us today. General Gaskin, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. Dr. Cuddler, thank you for hosting this. Tommy, every time I hear more of your story, I'm moved personally. I really am glad that you shared what you shared today. And I think I'll be able to make you proud with some of the changes that have come, not on the backs of my shoulders, but of those who've come before me. And I'm just representing their work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, where I'm at, and some of our values. You see our values there. I'm also going to go into some of the things that we do here in the soldier support services under the G1, what we're seeing and how we work. So I got here, I was born in 1974 in Berkeley, California. So you can imagine where my parents were in those days. In 1996, I joined the National Guard. They promised to pay for my education, which they did, and loved it. I enlisted as a Apache crew chief and had a deployment with them. Wanted to go to flight school, so I went through officer training and graduated a month before 9/11. And they said, oops, you're not going to flight school. We need you to be an ordnance officer. And then I ended up in the logistics field. So that's a little bit about where I came from, and where I'm at now is in the North Carolina National Guard, G1, which is their personnel division, and it covers all types of personnel services and resources. The particular section that I'm over is soldier support services, and these are our mission, vision, values. So our goal is to maintain individual soldier wellness. We want to sustain availability of those soldiers in the fight, and we want to prevent behaviors harmful to the good order and discipline of the organization. We support the G1 and the Adjutant General by strengthening those service members for mission success. And that strengthening covers a lot of it is emotional and intellectual strength. The physical strength comes through a lot of other training, but we're here to help provide some of those intangible strengths. And then our values. So we find the value of certain rights self-evident. We work to preserve the liveliness of our service members, protect their liberties by nurturing cultures of trust and respect, and then enriching their service through opportunities in education and employment. Next slide, please. Under soldier support services, we have a good number of programs. I'm going to talk primarily about the ones in bold. First up is our integrated behavioral health services. This is a toll-free number for any reserve component in North Carolina going through a crisis. Call our toll-free number. You'll be immediately integrated into our integrated behavioral health service. Ms. Stephanie Neeson has pioneered this starting in 2010 and run it very successfully for us for a very long time. We're really proud of her efforts and the work that she's done for us. This program then gets the service member or the service member's family through the point of crisis and then integrates them to any one of these other resources they need, whether it's financial, whether it's emotional, behavioral health counseling, et cetera. We have a sexual harassment assault response program, a resiliency program, which includes our suicide prevention program, casualty operations, our funeral honor, survivor outreach services, and family programs. And these ones that I've highlighted in bold are the ones that most come in contact with soldiers going through a crisis. Some of the other programs we have here help us identify those, but these are the ones that are touching soldiers and family members going through crisis. And those folks that are going through crisis are the ones that we see as being most at risk, especially as we're discussing suicide. Dr. Cuddler, I really liked your statement in your opening comments there. Love your organic approach to wellness. So as we look at some of the folks that are helping us understand soldiers going through crisis, we can't study them like lab rats. And I really like that piece in there. They are co-patriots with us in the mission to help find a solution. And I noted in a previous discussion, I think it was under part 4, there was a quote from Dr. Vanderkolk finding a sense of safety in your own body was a very important piece of the solution. And so finding safety, absolutely key to some of our programs, and then making sure that that person can help maintain it and that they are integrated into a network that helps them maintain that safety. So I've covered a little bit about who I am, where I'm at now. Soldier Support Services, these are the programs we're doing. I'd like to go to the next slide, and this is where I'll spend most of our time. A difficult part of building this slide is how do you visually articulate the integration of the soldier's experience, the family member's experience going through crisis and suicidality with our programs and the efforts of our command to help intervene. And that's difficult. So you see my best efforts here. Anything that's unclear, I apologize for, but let me walk you through a framework of how we are seeing soldiers and their family members go through crisis. One thing that's unique to the Army, or the military, I should say, is that as a profession, we are trying to develop a will to fight. If you translate this into other agencies or other departments, you may see it as develop a perseverance in the face of adversity. So if you look at policemen, firemen, et cetera, any of your emergency responders, a lot of these may correlate to this same structure right here. A will to go above and beyond what is normally called upon our average citizens. And this is really important for us, for the military, for the Army in particular, to be able to accomplish its mission. We can have the right training, we can have the right tools, but if we can't get anyone to actually push the buttons, turn the wheels, pull the triggers, then we're not an effective fighting force. We have to have a will to fight. And then below that, you have the area that all of us generally live in. Generally speaking, most of society has a will to live. When you can't breathe, you try and get to a place where you can breathe. If you're underwater too long, you try and come up out of the water. This natural will to live. And so this is where most of society is at. And you'll see on the left-hand side, I've got resilience there. Our resiliency programs cover all of these aspects: the will to fight, the will to die. How do we build resilience in the face of adversity? As we're discussing suicide, though, we're looking at individuals who are no longer at the point of will to fight. They have lost the will to live. And somewhere now they have entered this area of a will to die. They have started designing a plan or exploring the options of dying. And so following the left-hand side and then counterclockwise around to the right. A lot of times what we're seeing, and again, this is not a perfect picture, but we see soldiers and family members going through their social networks, going through their family relationships, going through their work, and trying to find some support factor, some stabilization for their feelings, for their emotions, etc. It may not go in that order, but we see them going through those areas. Some of them start seeking new experiences. They want that adrenaline high again. They want to experience some of the things that they saw and felt overseas. And so they're engaging in maybe some high-risk behaviors. You start seeing carelessness. A common one that we've seen from some high-risk behaviors, or people start wanting to get rid of their personal protective equipment. They say, well, I can do it without this. It doesn't really matter. I always want to be the first guy through the door, or, let me be the first in the convoy all the time, because that's the one that often gets hit. So you start seeing a carelessness with their own lives. And then you see a lot of times a growth in different vices, whether it's misuse of drugs, alcohol, etc., whatever that vice is for them, until they come to the point where they have completed not only a plan, but actually completed their suicide. So if this is a general framework for what is going on with the soldier and the individual, what we've determined to do, and what our command has determined to do, is to be able to interrupt this cycle at every point that we can possibly touch. So when we're looking at our programs, and we have our family programs and our child and youth and the financial counseling and building out those family relationships, we want those family relationships to be built strong within the home. We want those family relationships to be built strong with one another across the community, or even across the Guard community, and that helps us build resilience. We want those social networks to be strong. So as we're looking at networking different soldiers, different family members across the state, we're touching them, we're putting them in touch with local community assets. We're putting them in touch with other assets, both public and private. As we look at work, we're engaged with the employers in our communities. We're trying to find the best way to maintain not only a good soldier, but also a good worker in the community, and let those employers see what benefit their soldiers bring, and let their soldiers experience some of the successes that they need. Some of that also goes to education in our employment center. So if they need additional certification, or if they need some additional education to move their career forward, we will pay for that. And the state assembly last year, General Assembly last year, recently approved some changes to our North Carolina tuition assistance program, which allows us a great deal of freedom in paying for education. Our employment center, we want those soldiers and their family members both to find the work that's meaningful to them. So we're trying to interrupt this suicidal cycle at each one of these points. And where we see some successes, and I'll also talk about some missed opportunities. Where we see some successes are in work groups just like this. We are seeing a growing emphasis on the desire to keep people alive, not just alive, but productive, to become lively themselves, so that they're not just living in I'm alive but comatose state, but they are actually enjoying their lives, and that they are a benefit to others. And that sort of rich life experience is what we're trying to build for our soldiers, that network. A lot of times for the National Guard, and this is another area where I really appreciated Tommy's comments about the National Guard redeployment. If I'm on Fort Bragg as an active duty soldier and I deploy and I come back, my first 3 weeks, I'm there at my unit with all of my buddies that I deployed with, and we're cleaning our gear, we're putting stuff away, we're unpacking and repacking stuff, et cetera, and we're talking, and we're working out all of those issues that we experienced overseas. And we have all that help right on post, the behavioral health folks right on post, psychological readiness programs right on post. We have all the social networks right on post to help us out. Those first 3 weeks, critical in that decompression zone. And then for the months after that, you're going through a whole new cycle of rebuilding. And so you have all that access and that friendship right there on post. But for a National Guards member, we have soldiers serving the North Carolina National Guard from all over the country. And we have folks that fly in from Arizona and Texas and Florida and New Jersey that come to drill, and they deploy with us when they deploy. But when they go home, they're going home to their own states, and they're falling into social networks that are not familiar with the stresses of the military or of deployment. We have soldiers from Asheville and Murphy all the way out to Mania, and they're going back home to networks and communities that don't fully understand the stresses of a military that a military family goes through during a deployment and reintegration. And so our reintegration program, the Yellow Ribbon reintegration program, and our family programs and our transition assistance advisors really work hard to connect our soldiers and their families to the local resources available. And we're seeing in the success column here a growth in those resources across the state from multiple different areas, not directed from one particular area, but we're seeing growth from county to county. We're seeing growth from the state. We're seeing growth from private folks taking an interest in this too as well. Unfortunately, we've also seen quite a few missed opportunities. Over my almost 2 years of being here, we've buried quite a few, and our Casualty Operations Center is the center that receives those calls. And it's heart-wrenching to hear and then have to go through the investigations on each one and see the families torn apart by it. And that weighs heavily on me and on a lot of the folks here that have to deal with that. And it strengthens our resolve to do better tomorrow, to build stronger relationships today, and to build resilience into the future. So with that, I will pause here and turn it back to you, Dr. Cuddler. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That really hits home. I was North Carolina National Guard. I went in 1996 and deployed to Iraq 2005, 2006 during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. And I had 4 children at home. So it was very hard on our family. My marriage did not survive that, but it's good to hear that all of these resources are available. I have a lot of dear friends still serving in the National Guard, and I'll be glad to pass along the information that you've shared with us. Next, we have Dr. Jessica Morgan. She is a research psychologist with training in applied social and community psychology and expertise in military behavioral health. She is currently the Vice President of Research and Development at Continuous Precision Medicine. They are so lucky to have her. We miss her greatly. She helped us get the governor's challenge off of the ground and made a lot of progress. And we're so proud of you and so glad to have you. Welcome, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So we can go ahead and get started with the slides. I want to preface this by saying this is sort of a departure from some of the discussion that we've been having to look at sort of this other piece of people's experiences. This is sort of ending, it's the culmination of this 5-part series about veteran suicide. And so one of the things that I just want to mention is that trauma is ubiquitous. When I say trauma, I think some people get into sort of a clinical mindset. There's a very specific way that we can define trauma. But when I say trauma, I'm talking about anything that someone considers a major crisis, an adverse event, a stressful experience. This is really any event that challenges someone's core beliefs or their fundamental assumptions about the world. So we all sort of have these assumptions that we operate with throughout the day, and anything that challenges that, whether it's through moral injury or, good things happen to good people and all sorts of different assumptions. Anything that challenges those or disrupts that can be considered traumatic. And this is not limited to the military. So I always like hearing Tommy remind us that we can get very focused in the veteran space and think that this is a very unique experience to all of us, but we all experience trauma in our lives. Certainly, this literature is also talked about with bereaved parents or patients dealing with a medical diagnosis. Crystal, you can go to the next slide. And that is the experience of post-traumatic growth. So we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress. And I think there's been a growing familiarity, luckily, over the past several decades about the stressors that can happen after trauma. But I think what's less often talked about, or at least defined in this way, is this idea of post-traumatic growth. And that's defined as positive personal changes that result from the struggle to deal with trauma and its psychological consequences. That's very jargony, but the point that I will make is that this is not necessarily that the personal changes are coming because of the trauma. We don't want to ever sort of glorify the trauma itself. This is really the changes that result from our cognitive work that we do to integrate that adversity into our lives. And in the post-traumatic growth literature, we sort of recognize these 5 domains. And those are greater appreciation of life, or a changed sense of priority, warmer or more intimate relationships with others, a greater sense of personal strength. This is where you'll hear people say, if I can handle that, I know I can handle anything. Spiritual development and new possibilities. And one of the things that we see a lot with new possibilities is advocacy for others who are in similar circumstances. You can go to the next slide, Crystal, please. I'm just putting this up here because I know that we also make this available as a PDF. And so if anyone wants to go back and review for the data nerds, this is the actual model that I had created in my work. But what I'd like to do is actually go to the next slide to then discuss it, which is more of a conceptual model that we can talk about. But anyone who is a geek like me can go back and actually look at that. And it's published in a paper in military psychology as well. So this is sort of the model that I had built about how post-traumatic growth is related to our overall well-being. And we know that our well-being is related to then dying by suicide, right? So any of those more distal outcomes, whether it's substance misuse or relationship issues, all of these things are going to be considered negative sequelae of, PTSD or the trauma itself. But a lot of times I think what happens is we get siloed in whether it's in research or in our actual clinical work, or whatever way you're supporting military service members, veterans, and their families in the community. And oftentimes we have a section who is focusing specifically on PTS, and then we have another segment who's focusing on post-traumatic growth. And they're not understanding that they're obviously intertwined. So I wanted to create a more holistic idea. And so the model that I tested actually showed that post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress are actually highly correlated, which makes sense, right? The more adversity we go through, the more opportunity there is for both of these to happen. And so we have this challenge to the core beliefs on the left side. And what happens is we have this sort of rumination piece. This is us thinking about it. And we talk about this in clinical terms as either intrusive rumination, which is when you have thoughts coming into your head that you're not in control of, when you just have sort of these bad memories pop up or these thoughts pop up. And then deliberate rumination, this is really the cognitive work that we do when we take the time to think about what this trauma is, what it means to us, and how it's integrated into our lives. And we know in general that intrusive rumination is related to higher amounts of PTS, and deliberate rumination is related to higher amounts of post-traumatic growth. Overall, basically, what I found is that the growth and the stress together are what makes up our total well-being. So if you think about a scale and trying to tip that scale, Crystal, if you advance to the next one, it might be easier to understand where we can intervene. And that is that a lot of people in the clinical work, they're looking at decreasing intrusive rumination and trying to decrease PTS symptoms, which is obviously very, very important. We want to be working on those things. But a sort of complementary option, an alternative option, is to help facilitate post-traumatic growth. So you may still be having the nightmares, or you may still be having flashbacks, but if you can also increase this sort of sense of appreciation, just taking a moment to really appreciate time with children or the sound of laughter. Or I had in a book that I'm writing, I did some interviews with veterans, and one guy talked about just sitting on a really cold day with a coffee in his hand and watching snowflakes fall out the window and just feeling this insane amount of appreciation for life. If we can bolster those pieces, then it's a complementary and alternative option to working on the PTS, so that in the meantime, we overall are tipping those scales to increase our overall well-being. Next slide, please. So oftentimes when I talk about this, particularly with all of you who are joining us with the governor's working group, the question is, how can I help, right? How do I make this happen? I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a social worker, whatever that piece is. And it's really to support the journey. So this is a journey that is going to happen for the service member, by the service member. This is not work that we can do for them. We can be aware that growth will not happen for all domains, for all people, or in all situations. I think that there can be this sort of puppies and rainbows view of post-traumatic growth, that as soon as someone hears about it, they want to run out and start telling everybody, but you can grow from this. This is actually, what happened to you was bad, but here's the positive side of things. We don't want to force that. Next slide, please. You'll hear a lot of people talk about creating a narrative. And this is something that I think friends and family can help with, social networks, and then anything that's actually program support. So if you're in program development or evaluation, looking at ways that we can incorporate narrative and meaning making a sense of what happened. Oftentimes when people experience something traumatic, the way that they encode the memory is not in a neat, orderly, linear, chronological way. So they have sort of snippets of what happened. And oftentimes what we lose in that is cause and effect, and seeing that there were pieces or contexts that are missing in our memory. So you see this one snapshot of something that you could have done differently, or that you feel guilt about, without understanding that, this was part of a larger piece, an order that someone else gave you, or that's, that something else was happening. And so the more we tell the story and create this narrative through telling and retelling, we start to link elements and see the cause and effect. And we can sort of, over time, make these more factual based. I'm not trying to throw a whole bunch of psychology at you, but the other thing we talk about is like hot and cold memories. So oftentimes when we discuss our trauma, and anyone who's has experience with prolonged exposure therapy, when you first tell a story about an adverse event, it's considered a hot memory. And that is that you have the physiological arousal, your heart might start racing, you're sweating, you feel all of that. But the more you tell it, it becomes more of a fact-based memory, a colder memory, where you can remember all of the details, but it doesn't have that same power. So oftentimes the questions that we want people to be asking is, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my life and for my future? Next piece, please. One of the things that helps is to label growth. And again, we're not forcing this on anyone, but just to be aware of the people that we're talking to, whether this is our brothers and sisters, our family members, co-workers, or the people with whom we come in contact through Governor's Working Group and the great outreach that we're doing. You might hear things like, I have a greater appreciation for the value of my own life. I know I can better handle difficulties, is one that I mentioned. I'm stronger than I thought I was. There are these other ones about greater sense of closeness with others and how wonderful people are. And that's really going to depend on the type of adversity. But these are the things that you might start to hear. Next slide, please. So if you know Doc French, she is out of Charlotte, and she talks a lot about being an expert companion. And again, this is that we are not the creators of growth for people. We can help facilitate this. And we're really just trying to sort of nurture the naturally occurring processes that are going on. It's a lot about listening without trying to solve people's problems, and labeling the growth when we hear it without forcing it. Again, this is not so much a focus on the event, which some of the more clinical aspects, cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, are going to be more about the event. This is really about the struggle. And one of the best predictors of experiencing post-traumatic growth is having other models and being exposed to people who have said, these are the things that happen to me. And because of this, I also actually feel these positive things. Yes, it has had these negative impacts, but I also now am able to do all these other things. And certainly for anyone who's looking to actually either do this for themselves or for others, writing assignments that help us develop a narrative are often used. Next piece. I won't focus a lot on this, but there is a note that I want to make about spirituality. In my work, it was the least endorsed domain. They're a segment of the population that are obviously, they call them foxhole atheists, which is just that people may not feel this strong religious connection as military veterans, but there's a difference between religiosity and spirituality. And so oftentimes the way that this looks in the literature that I've seen and in the work that I've done is just a sense that you have a greater purpose than yourself. There's, patriotism can be a sense of spirituality, or fighting for the person to the left and right of you can be a sense of spirituality. And that we don't need to just think about this organized religion as an aspect. Next slide. So I'll give you my key takeaways again, which is that these are not mutually exclusive. These are not opposites. People don't either experience post-traumatic stress or experience post-traumatic growth. It will not happen in all cases, but we can certainly make sure that we're helping others to understand that trauma, or even a diagnosis of PTSD, is not a life sentence and it's not a death sentence. And oftentimes these are temporary issues that we're experiencing. And one of the quotes that I really like is, if you're going through hell, keep going, right? So one of the things is, if we can sort of recognize the impact on it and make sure that we're paying attention to this, I think we can expand a more holistic view of what it looks like following adversity. Next page. Yep. So this is all my contact information. Again, this is going to be shared by Crystal. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cuddler just shortly. I do have a question for Luke. I'm sorry. Let me get back to it. For Lieutenant Colonel Walliser, when a returning service member is out processing at Fort Bragg and shows signs of trauma, are they able to remain on active duty and get the treatment needed? Dr. Cuddler, I'll turn it over, let Lieutenant Colonel answer that, and you all can begin your roundtable.
Yes, so for most of the last 15 years, a soldier returning from a National Guard soldier returning from a deployment or from an active duty, they would come through their demob station, whether it was Fort Bragg, Fort Bliss, Fort Hood, wherever. And if they were identified as at risk or any other physical ailments, not just emotional or mental, they would be put on, extended on orders until they were returned or stabilized in such a way as they were seen either fit for service and returned to service, or medically separated. Recently, with the drawdown and the recent change in budgeting, a lot of those automatic active duty orders are no longer in place. What they're doing now is putting soldiers on orders in their community. So the soldiers oftentimes will go home and either get the treatment locally and be paid until they're restored, but it's more of a community oriented tactic rather than putting them on active duty and keeping them at the demobilization site. Does that answer the question?
I am going to assume that, yes, that came from Mark Tichy. It came through Facebook. And so Dr. Cuddler, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Crystal. And thanks to all the panelists. I want to say just a few quick comments on each of the panelists and then leading into a question for all of you. Tommy mentioned, the idea of tribe and also spoke to how that powerful moment where you've been bonded together in war and then come home and disperse, and that tribe isn't there anymore, and the kind of, just as Noel Guerrero said in the New York Times article, you're just alone when you had all these people around you who have become closer to you often than your own family feels to you at this point. In fact, your own family feels alien to you, and these people aren't there for you anymore. It did remind me of Sebastian Junger's book, who really talked about the unique and powerful bonds that formed and what it means to lose them. And that kind of came into Lieutenant Colonel Walliser's talk, who also commented on when the Guard comes home and they go back from Murphy to Manio, when the people who were individual replacements within the Guard from New Jersey or Texas to take on certain parts of the mission go back to New Jersey or Texas and aren't anywhere near, don't go back to drill with the people they deployed with, and where that leaves them. Also, I want to say, Lieutenant Colonel Walliser, Freud would be very happy with the way that you thought about that will to die. Thinking about World War I veterans, Freud came up with what he called the death instinct, which, to keep it in his language pretty much, except he said it in German, is you can only take so much simulation before you don't want any more. And we've kind of heard that in what veterans have told us when they're at the extreme. I don't want any more of this. I can't feel anymore, or I don't want to feel anymore. Jessica, you spoke about how post-traumatic growth can accompany post-traumatic stress, but how these two are in a dynamic with one another, and kind of goes back to that slide of Lieutenant Colonel Walliser, where he shows there's this dynamic between the will to live, the will to fight, but also the will to die, that these things are all floating around in dynamic. And that brings me back to part of his slide and part of what Tommy was saying about his life, his relationships, his buddies, his family, that it's very hard, especially once people are out of the military, but even while they're still in their unit, whether it's a guard unit that has special problems, or even a military unit that goes back to being in garrison, their active duty, it's very hard for people from outside the unit who are potentially helpers, potentially able to push people in the right direction of that dynamic toward positive and strong relationships and a will to live, and against that sense of despair or aimlessness or restlessness. It's very hard for people like the people on this call, the people out who are listening to us, to break into those tribes. And so I was wondering to ask each of the panelists the question, how can those community supports, those extended family members, those members of the unit organization who didn't deploy but kind of want to be there to help and have some links, how do those people reach the individuals and into the tribes, the communities that need that kind of in reach, but being a tribe tend to resist it? Tough question, which we haven't answered in the last 15 years, but I figured in the last 10 minutes or so, you guys would get it.
I was going to see if Tom, you wanted to take it first, but I will say we had an informal discussion, this group here the other day, and I think that at the risk of, pressuring, I don't want people to start having their tagline of whatever their piece of the work is. Tommy, we talked about this, of them, everyone saying that they're in suicide prevention. I don't want us, making claims, but I really strongly believe that everybody, if you're on this call, that you have a hand in suicide prevention. Your piece of the pie, whether that's in helping with, community at the local community college. We have people from Wake Tech who are helping. We have financial aid officers, people that are helping with employment, people that are helping with benefits. At each touch point, it really takes the entire support network and all of those touch points to make sure that someone is there. Because like you said, Dr. Cuddler, I don't think that any of us can guarantee that one person can break into that tribe. It's really that if all of us are there as a community support, that along the way, it doesn't get so downstream. Dr. Jason Newsman talks about getting upstream in suicide prevention, and that is because by the time it's reached a point of crisis, in that last hour, it's very unlikely that any one of us on this call will be right there to intervene. We really want to be intervening long before that so it doesn't reach that point.
That's a wonderful answer. And I wonder, Tommy or Lieutenant Colonel Walliser, any addition to that, or we can also go forward and open up the floor a little more.
No, I think, Dr. Cuddler, your question prompts me to look at suicide and beyond what we've talked about here. We've talked about trauma, obviously, being a part of it. And it'd be easy to say that, hey, if the soldiers came back after a traumatic experience overseas, and if more people in the community also had their own forms of trauma and you could relate to trauma recovery together. I'm not advocating for everybody to go through traumatic experiences, but you could say that there would be some key component, common component that folks could relate to. But what we're seeing on the military side now is a different generation of soldier and a different generation of suicide. And maybe you could even eventually expound more on your own research on looking at different generations. But you look at our last couple in the Guard, 21 years old, no deployments, hasn't been anywhere, barely out of the house. Some of these are young kids who are deciding to hit the reset button on life really way too early in the game. And, this is not, this isn't a video game we're playing. This is real life. And it pains me to see them hitting a permanent reset button when, relatively speaking, they have not experienced anywhere near the trauma that, so many others have gone through and even thrived from. So, I don't know how to answer the question directly about how do you reintegrate them and get more people involved with that prevention, because I think we're seeing in a lot of cases here a growing number of suicides that don't have some of those more relatable trauma-induced causes. I'll turn it back to you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I want to let Tommy respond, and then if he has something to add here. And you've spurred a memory for me that might be relevant too.
Yeah, Dr. Cuddler, I mean, clearly it's a large question. I don't think there's obviously one simple thing. I think of myself as a parent. It starts with me teaching my children about the emotional intelligence and connection to human, being present with an individual. To me, that's kind of where it all starts. If you can create a relationship and create an atmosphere and that relationship to talk about those struggles or things from an early age, you create those behaviors. But I think as it stands now within the community, it starts with just little things, little pieces, asking questions, being curious, trying to figure out why. And if you're in the space, answer, why are you doing this? Are you doing this for you? Or are you doing this for a greater problem, to solve the problem? We can get complacent. We can chase after some of these things, but I think it's really pushing each other just to be better and be greater. And then ultimately, we need some quarterbacks. We need people aligning some of these issues and aligning some of this work. I feel like we have some of that in place, but obviously room for improvement to get better. And then, ultimately, like what we're doing now, these open forums, communication, but we also want to be able to get into a place where we can have honest communication and maybe not hold back. It's hard because we have so many state and government entities, and you got to be careful about what you say. I get it. And, medical professionals, but, when you see somebody full of crap, you need to be able to call them out and be held accountable just like we are as individuals. So I'll shut up now, Dr. Cuddler. Thank you.
No, very useful, Tommy. And, and once again, you're speaking to the real world, which is hard for doctors to remember. And it's, we've had a lot of training too, and we're trained to look at things a certain way and often under a microscope, and it doesn't help. And sometimes if you look in a microscope, the trouble is you can only see what's in your field of vision and you miss everything else on the slide, let alone a real person. And I'll give you an example. And this is also what I was coming to with Lieutenant Colonel Walliser. So we're presenting this giant 1.5-year study with every alphabet soup agency in the world, and really wonderful people did their best on this thing. And we're presenting it in the Pentagon to the ACMAC, the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. So it's really pretty cool. And there are all these generals and people all sitting all around a huge boardroom. And we give him all the data, and he says, this is very important. Thank you. We're going to do something about this. And I know he meant it. And we did do a bunch of things. But, frankly, I don't think that's where things really changed. Things don't change from the Pentagon to somebody's house in the middle of the night. So when everybody was leaving the room, and the few of us who were there to present were the visitors, and we stayed till the last, 2 officers who had been sitting on the side and the back came up to us and said, we'll tell you what was really wrong with the 2-7. These guys went to a new province in Afghanistan where the Marines hadn't been before. There was no infrastructure. You didn't know who to trust. They weren't trained. This was for this mission. then their mission was changed as they arrived. They got no support whatsoever. And when they got home, they got no support whatsoever. And so it's not at all surprising that they feel pretty badly and they're having a lot of trouble. And it seemed to me, how come we spent a year and a half talking about this unit, drilling down to individuals, drilling down to medical records, police records, coroner records, questions that we could frame, but nobody had told us that. And that would have been a really good thing to talk about. And maybe we would have learned about that. You know, maybe that's really important. It sounds important. But again, that's the kind of thing that a unit might not tell you. They could tell each other, but they might not tell you because that would be complaining. And although, as was pointed out, it is the saying is it's a soldier's prerogative to complain, they won't do that with people who aren't of their unit, who aren't other veterans. And this has really been a challenge, but one I think, you know, the governor's challenge, because we have so many Guard and Reserve, so many veterans, I think we're helping overcome it. It's still not easy.
I would just also point out as a last part to what Lieutenant Colonel Wallace was saying is that, you know, we tend to think of the military as this very siloed experience, but people are coming from their own home lives and they have lives outside of the military as well. And all of those interactions matter. So no one is just either a service member right now or not. And we know that a lot of the people who enter the military are more likely to have trauma in their histories than their peers who do not join the military. So while a 21-year-old who has never deployed may seem like someone who, all of the records that we haven't seen combat-related trauma, the opportunity that we have is that they will likely, if they are seeking help, whether it's for military-related or not, it is likely going to be us who are in the military behavioral health and support network that have an opportunity to touch those people. So I think that's sort of the other key thing to remember is that it may not be something military related that we're looking for or that we're seeing, and not to forget to ask about those other pieces of someone's, life, but we are still going to probably be the ones when they have the help seeking behaviors who will be able to reach them.
Well, and I'll add, and this goes back to Lieutenant Colonel Wallicer's question also, for the longest time, the story on the cover of magazines would be poor veteran comes back broken from combat area and commits suicide or dies by suicide. We try not to say that, but I'm getting old and I stuck with that. But poor veteran dies by suicide after horrific combat experience. And yet the statistics told us for most of the years of OEF, OIF, OND, that suicide was not increased in proportion to deployment. In fact, most people who died by suicide in the military had not deployed. But then you get these units where that's more of an issue. And I think the 2-7 is a good example where everybody had to improvise, adapt, and overcome, even if they weren't Marines. And very often the mission you did was not the mission you trained for. Surprise, you're now guarding a convoy of pizza trucks, with drivers from across the Middle East. You're not a combat unit, or you're not a combat stress control unit even. You're now, backing up helicopters somehow or another. So, but that idea that the story that people want to tell is not the real story is also in the way.
Yeah, Dr. Cuddler, if I may, I also think, look, we're talking about less than 1% that served. Most people, we forget, especially in these spaces, at least I'll speak for myself, the last 10 years working in the veteran organizational area, most of the world doesn't understand, doesn't know. We have that major, as much as we talk about it, I think we assume that most people can understand or at least know that there's a problem. They forget. Most people, not necessarily, I can't say that they don't care, but they're ignorant to just about everything that we're talking about. And we assume because we live in it, work in it, talk about it, deal with it. The reality is, how would they know?
Although I always like to remind people there are 19 million living American veterans, and each of them has on average 1.5 dependents who are actually eligible often for DoD or VA benefits and who have often lived this experience with them or some part of it. Even if they weren't married at the time, they're living that experience now, not knowing it. I'm always amazed at military kids who were born long after their parents come back from war, know all the rules of what you can't talk about, how loud you can be, who you can have over, and when you better back off, because nobody ever has to say a word about what happened. The kids often say, no, my parents never told me anything about their military service, but they still know the rules. But that means that there are about 50 million Americans. And then if you add the military, people currently in the military, you're getting close to 60 million Americans. 1 in every 5 Americans has touched the military in some important way. So it's sad though that it's not, that this isn't something we talk about more often, and how invisible service members, and particularly their family members, are outside of the military once they take their uniform off. I want to go to something that Lieutenant Colonel Wallace said in response to Dr. Morgan, that everyone brings their whole lives with them to service. That is such an important lesson. And I don't know if you'd want to expand on that, Colonel Wallace, sir. There are so many statistics. Women in the military, I believe, are 4 times, or several times, I believe it's 4 times more likely to have been victims of abuse, sexual abuse or otherwise, than the average American woman. An awful lot of men join the military to be a man, to grow up and maybe live up to what other generations of their family have gone through, and face all sorts of challenges. 57% of everybody on active duty in the Army, a few years ago when we last looked at this number, were children of military members. It's not a coincidence why people end up in the military. And in some ways, we have a military dynasty in the United States. These are families that serve intergenerationally, and they bring things with them: standards, values, fears, stories, warnings, tough experiences, maybe demonstrated coping skills with alcohol. The British are always saying they have half the rate of PTSD of any other English-speaking country, and that's what they report. But they have much higher rates of alcohol. So, pick your poison. But yeah, you bring your whole life. I don't know, Colonel, anything else you'd like to add to that idea?
Well, I will just add one thing. But first of all, I need to apologize and say Dr. Morgan instead of the first name. I was looking at the screen, I saw the name up there, and that's what I use. So
This is just fine.
Okay. Thank you. No, I think you're exactly, Dr. Morgan, I think you're exactly right, though, talking about a lot of times the person helping service the service member, a lot of times you're helping them unpack trauma that they experienced before they came into service, right? And that's all part of helping develop a service member and a service member's family that can actually produce in the job that they were hired to do. And for example, myself, my personal traumatic experience came as a 14-year-old in a drunk driving accident that killed 27 people. So very young, did not know how to deal with it, and didn't know how to deal with that trauma coming into the military. Why did I join the military then? But it's oftentimes the military service that is helping that person unpack some of that trauma that they brought in as part of their normal lives. And I think it is important. And we're seeing that in our programs as we're getting folks into our integrated behavioral health and family programs. We're seeing folks unpack things from before they joined. And the goal is obviously to make them a serviceable soldier, somebody who can support and defend the Constitution, and obey the orders given to them. But in order to do that, they got to be able to build that emotional and intellectual strength, spiritual strength to withstand adversity. And that means addressing some of the things that they brought with them. So that's all I'll say. Thank you.
It's very well said. And that's a process that goes from, I think, boot camp all the way through your training and perhaps with you into war, and then in the homecoming. You're constantly growing, and to Dr. Morgan's point, the things that make you grow, the things that propel that growth, can push you in different directions and give you, in the end, an admixture of strengths, resiliency, and vulnerability. And Crystal's let us know we've got about 6 more minutes. So closing remarks from Tommy and I would say Jess too. I'm only saying Lieutenant Colonel, well, because I don't like to call officers by their first names, but but the floor is open for closing remarks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Cuddler. Thanks for today. I love the forum that we're talking about these things continuously. The work that we're doing is extremely important to me. The biggest thing that I always worry about is my children and the generational trauma. And when we think about the impact area and everybody that is touched by even the decisions that I've made and all the trauma, that the trail of trauma along the way, for all the things that I've done, and even for the attempts and my ex-wife and all the relationships and all the people that are touched by these things, they carry that, and it just dominoes. So I say that. And then the last thing is something I learned from Blake Bourne, the executive director at Veterans Patrol. The saying, I know it's not his, but I just love this quote. If you want to go somewhere or go fast, you go alone. You go far, you go together. And I think that's what we're doing here. So thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Dr. Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, my closing remark is just, thank all of you for tuning in. This is really the boots on the ground work that is going to make a difference. And I know that it can feel like we're not moving the needle quickly enough. But I promise you that at the aggregate level, what we're seeing is great progress. And it's because we all are here to care about each other and find a way. And so whatever that looks like in your space, I would just encourage you to, keep pushing and understand that I'm sort of here to offer the glimmer of hope that we all experience some really adverse things in life, whether it's military related or not. But it's also ultimately what does allow us to grow and find other things. And it will never be that it's, puppies and rainbows and unicorns. I don't want to be that person, but that we all have an opportunity to help each other create a narrative. It's what makes us who we are. And there's certainly life beyond it. And that life can be pretty amazing. So thank you all for joining.
And Colonel Walliser, any closing comments from you?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you for inviting the National Guard into your discussion here. This is obviously a very important topic. I'd like to leave you and the listeners and viewers of this panel discussion with a thought and idea, and that is, why is an individual's life really important? And why is the Army concerned with keeping you alive? Is it because it's inconvenient if you commit suicide and it causes a lot of paperwork? Or is there really truly a life's purpose for you that goes above and beyond even your service in uniform that you were created to do? And I don't know where that fits in the discussion. It's an area that I think is not entirely addressed by some of the Army literature on it right now, but it is certainly in the hallway discussions as we look at why, if I'm facing a soldier, why is it important for him to be at drill every weekend? Why is it important for him to serve? And why is it important for him to stay alive? I think helping answer that question will probably move us closer to finding a solution. That's all I got. Thank you, sir.
Well, and thank you. And these are questions that people have been asking as long as there's been war. And if you read Jonathan Shea's Odysseus, Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, he points out that the great Greek tragedies are often written by soldiers for soldiers, and were performed for soldiers, not as entertainment, but as a chance to frame the very questions you're asking, Colonel Wallacer. And we're still asking those questions. I just want to say thank you to everyone, and this being the last of our 5 sessions on the social determinants of war, an inspiration that Crystal and Lee and Jeff came up with in early conversations. I just want to thank everyone who's participated in this entire series. Once again, my very best to Jeff. I know I'll be working with him again. I don't know where or when, but I know I will. And to Crystal too, who has reinvented herself and continues to be in the fight. Crystal, let me turn things over to you for any last words.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that I appreciate you all. This has been a wonderful series. You can go back and watch the series. Please sign up for the newsletter email list at ncgwg.org. You can list your events there. You can look at the calendar and find events there that are happening across the state. Our next meeting is going to be February the 24th, 2022. Our topic will be housing and homeless services. Jessica, I will ride the unicorn across the rainbow and capture all the puppies, and all of you scholars can ground me on the other side. Lieutenant General Gaskin has popped back in. Do you want to say one final word, Secretary Gaskin?
No, I'd just like to emphasize to everyone that this was a great opportunity to learn the determinants of what we are, and also from this, how do we address solutions and to get past just the education, but the actual action. So thanks everybody for being in. Once again, a super job, Crystal, in moderating this.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure. See you all in February.